Hi everybody. So this term in art we're going to have a look at something called botanical illustration. Now, it sounds like quite a complicated term, but it's actually more simple than you would think. Now, the emphasis of botanical illustration is on science rather than art. So even though it's about illustration, it's as much about science, in fact it's more about science than it is about the actual picture or painting that's produced. Botanical illustration is always a true and lifelike representation of a plant. It should highlight a plant's distinguishing features, so the key parts of a plant, and this would enable botanists, oh there's another word that we might not have ever heard, botanists, they are people who are experts or even students in the scientific study of plants, so people who study plants and are experts at looking at them and studying them. So this would actually help botanists to tell one plant from another. Often botanical illustrations are monochrome. That means that they're often done just in black and white, but not always. And in fact, the two artists that we're going to look at this term have colour on a lot of the pictures that they've done, but we'll find out a little bit more about that. Sometimes they were drawn with pencil, and in fact the colour was added afterwards. So when I say monochrome, I mean black and white, and we'll have a practice at doing some of that as well ourselves. So botanical illustration is the art of drawing or depicting, in whatever way, whatever medium an artist wants to, it's the art of depicting the form, the colour and the details of a plant species. Now that sounds funny if all the drawings are monochrome, but actually there was a lot of labelling used as well. So even if a picture was drawn just with pencil and it was just black and white, the artist who'd drawn it would add labels and labels and labels describing the colours that they could see. So botanical illustrations should be based on the observation of living plant material. So that means that if you're doing a botanical illustration, you would have a plant in front of you. When we talk about plant material, it's not just doing a still life picture. It's not like we'd get a vase of flowers out and then we'd just draw it. There is a lot of detail involved, and as I've said before, the emphasis is on the science. So sometimes when we talk about plant material, it would be actually kind of dissecting the plant and drawing each individual part of the plant. Sometimes botanical artists even use dried parts of plants, and they would do something which was called reconstitution, where they would get a dried part of a plant, maybe a petal from a flower or something like that, and then they would add water to try and bring it back to life, and then maybe press it and keep hold of it as part of their kind of recording of what that plant looked like. Sometimes botanical illustration includes using a microscope to really check out the features of a plant in real fine detail. They would use accurate measurements of a plant. So if they were drawing a particular flower, they wouldn't have petals that were way too big. They would actually look at the actual plant, measure it and make sure that their drawing was exactly what was on there, or label it if not. So often botanical artists would work alongside some of these expert botanists, the scientists who really studied plants. The illustrators would work alongside them to make sure that they were recording the real important parts of the plant, and really emphasising the bits that the scientists thought were really important to record. Now, also, if you're a botanical illustrator, you'd have a really good understanding of the morphology of a plant. Here's another word for you, morphology. Everybody say morphology. All it means is the shape or the form of the plant that help us distinguish from one plant to another. So, for example, a daisy has a completely different morphology to a daffodil. They look totally different, their shape is completely different, their form is different, there's different colours. That's what morphology means. So there's a few big words for you there. Botanist, which is a scientist or an expert in the study of plants. Morphology, which is the shape and form of a plant. And monochrome, which you might already know, which is a black and white drawing, basically. So often as well, botanical illustrations would kind of identify some key features of the plant, like at different stages of its life cycle. So they would often record the seed and it starting to grow, and then the different stages of growth and different parts of the life cycle. So you can see how these drawings were really more about the science than about the kind of visual art. There's no kind of artist impressions, there's no kind of abstract way of presenting these. They were really, really detailed, specific, and really lifelike. So it's quite an interesting thing to look at. And I feel excited about doing this with you guys, because I think what we can achieve at the end of this is going to be quite amazing, and it will help us to look at art in the way that a botanical illustrator would do, but also it's going to help with our scientific brains as well, and how we look at plants and how we value each part of them. So I'm going to start with a little question for you. Why do you think that botanical illustrations are important? I'm just going to let you have a little think about that for a moment. You might want to pause this while you think. So maybe you have thought about the fact that these illustrations could be really important because actually people have been able to draw since before they could take photographs, before they could film things. And maybe these botanical illustrators and botanical illustrations have actually been priceless pieces of art that have educated us and worked alongside science to show us new plant species and all these amazing things that we may not know about if someone hadn't actually illustrated them and put them down on paper. So here's a little bit of history for you. Botanical drawing dates back to at least ancient Egypt. It was especially developed in Europe during the Middle Ages, where plants were often used for medicinal purposes, and people needed to be able to tell which plants were safe and which ones were poisonous. A lot of plant families contained both medicine and poison, and if you think about it, the only way in those days that they could actually tell which plants were which were if somebody had drawn a really accurate drawing of them, and they studied the leaves on the drawing and checked the real plant to see whether they were actually picking a poisonous plant or whether they'd found the right one for the medicine that they needed. Explorers often brought botanical artists with them to record the plants that they found. So while people were off on their explorations all over the world, botanical artists and illustrators would go alongside them to record their findings. So our learning objective this time is to explore someone called Joseph Banks, to find out who he was, and then we're going to do a critique of a piece of his botanical art. So why don't you get yourself a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen so that you can take some notes while we're going through this information, so that when you come to do your bio in a minute, you've got a bit of information about Sir Joseph Banks. So take some notes as we're going through this. This is Sir Joseph Banks. He was born on February the 13th in 1743. And he was born in London, obviously in England, and there he is. His dad was called William Banks, and his dad was actually a wealthy Lincolnshire country squire. So his dad actually came from Lincolnshire. As a boy, Banks enjoyed exploring the Lincolnshire countryside, just like we do, and developed a keen interest in nature, history and botany, which is the study of plants. He studied at Oxford University. When he turned 21, he actually inherited the whole of his dad's estate, which was called Revesby Abbey, and that is actually in Lincolnshire. Google it, have a look, see what you can see. He then became a local squire, so he was quite an important person, and he shared his time between Lincolnshire and London, and he began to make friends amongst some of the scientific men of his time. As his influences kind of increased, he became an advisor to King George III, and he urged the king to support voyages of discovery to new lands, hoping that he could basically indulge his interest in botany and finding out about new plants. So he actually said to the king, please will you support some of these amazing voyages so that we can find out all about plants that we've never discovered before. So Sir Joseph Banks was appointed to join Captain James Cook, you might have heard of him, Captain Cook, on his voyage of discovery in the South Pacific Ocean on the ship, the HMS Endeavour. So here it is, have a look. The voyage went to Brazil. He then went to Tahiti, which is in New Zealand, and to the east coast of Australia. While he was in Australia, Sir Joseph Banks and some other scientists made the first major collection of Australian flora. That means the different types of flowers that they discovered in Australia. And they described so many new species that were new to science. So imagine all those years ago, he convinces King George III to let them go on this discovery with Captain Cook. And off they go to Australia, and they find all these amazing flowers that they've never seen before. They've got no knowledge of them, because how are they ever going to see them? There's no photographs, there's no film, there's no TV, there's no way of showing anybody that. So they get on the boat and off they go. They discovered almost 800 specimens of new flowers. And in fact, another artist, his name was Sidney Parkinson, he was alongside them and he helped to draw some of these new species of plants. And Sir Joseph Banks actually put them together in his first book. Have a look at it. And this is called the Florilegium. And it's called the Botanical Treasures from Cook's First Voyage. This was finally published in 35 volumes between 1980 and 1990. So actually, years and years and years after those illustrations were done, they were finally all put together in this book that we could get hold of today if we wanted to. When he got back from his first trip, he was immediately famous, basically. And in fact, he's so famous that in 2018, which is only 3 years ago, his face was actually put on a second-class stamp that kind of showed just how famous he had become. Have a look at some of the illustrations that he'd done. The things that they discovered on that very first voyage to Australia. Now, because Sir Joseph Banks was actually grew up in Lincolnshire, you might remember, maybe you won't, but I remember when I was a little girl, at the lawn, which is just near the castle, they opened something called the Sir Joseph Banks Conservatory, and it was a massive greenhouse, and it was a tropical hothouse, and it had loads of the plants in it that were related to Banks's voyages and the things that he'd found from all over the world, but including Australia. Now, the Sir Joseph Banks Conservatory isn't there anymore. It was taken down, but it was there for a good few years, and I remember going as a little girl to walk around and see the amazing plants and how warm it was. And some of you might remember when it was at the lawn, and now there's just a car park there. But the actual greenhouse is now at Woodside Falconry, and that's a hothouse, and it's got the butterflies in it. But I love the thought that Sir Joseph Banks grew up in Lincolnshire, and then in Lincoln we actually created a whole conservatory just to honour him and to basically house some of the plants that he had discovered. Sir Joseph Banks did very detailed pencil drawings. So that's where the monochrome thing comes from. He would find a plant, he'd study it and do these most detailed drawings. But in fact, when he got back, he turned those drawings into engravings that he did on copper. So he engraved his drawings into a piece of copper so that he could turn them into a print, so that he could use them as print to try and build up his collection. And he had the help of other artists as well, so he made these kind of stamps that were his pictures on an engraving, and then he would stamp them onto the paper, print them on, and then when they dried, other artists would add watercolour to them, and he would help them depict exactly the colours that he saw on his adventures. When we look at his art, we're probably seeing a print that was done by an engraving of his original drawing and then watercolour that was added to it. Have a look at this one. I just think this is absolutely amazing, and this is what I was talking about when it comes to it all being about science and how important it is for science, because you can see from here you've got the plant with that really interesting flower at the top with those kind of pointy bits, almost spiky bits coming out of the top in that lovely kind of scarlety red. And then the leaves have almost got prickles on them as well. They almost look a bit like holly leaves. But as you look further down, you'll see the head of the flower, and then you can see that it's been cross-sectioned, and you can see inside the flower and the different parts of the flower. And then even further down, those parts of the inside of the flower have actually been depicted individually on their own. And if you look really carefully, they're also numbered. So you can actually see all those tiny little details. And if you look really carefully as well, those brown bits are probably what it looks like underneath the flower when all the red petals and spiky bits have been removed. So you can see from this drawing that the detail was so important, and that scientists would come alongside and they would be able to learn so much about the plants. You will have been given a sheet, so it's either on Google Classrooms, or you can download it, you print it out, or if you're in school you'll have it there. At the top you've just got a little section for you to be able to write some of the information that you can remember about Sir Joseph Banks. You can go back in this video if you want to, you can check. Hopefully you've written a few notes, or you can Google, find out any other information that you can. And I just want a few sentences about Sir Joseph Banks. Who was he? Where did he live? What did he do? Who did he mix with? What kind of influence did he have on people? So that's your first section. And then the second section is a critique of a piece of Joseph Banks' botanical art. And when I say a critique, there's quite a lot that I want you to consider in this. Okay? There are 4 concepts that you need. And if you cover all of these things, or as much as you can, you're going to do a really, really good job of it. So have a look at this table. The first thing is to describe what you can see. What can you see in the artwork? Can you identify the media that has been used? Now we know that it was probably printed from a copper engraving based on an original drawing, and then probably watercolour was added to it. Can you identify the genre? Is it in a portrait position, or is it landscape? Is it abstract? Is it still life? Can you describe everything you can see, even if you can't explain it? So even if you don't know what it is, can you describe it? Can you say there are red, spiky kind of tendrils coming out? Even if you don't know what the right words are to use, but can you describe what you can see? And then we're going to analyse it. How are the lines and the shapes and the colours and the textures used in the piece of art? Is there a centre of interest or something called an eye grabber? When you look at the piece of art, is there something that stands out to you that you think, oh, that is a real point of interest there, that's a really important thing? And it might be different for all of you, just something that stands out that you can describe and draw attention to, and just analyse how those lines and shapes are used. The next one is to interpret what is going on in the artwork. What's the purpose of the piece? What is the artist trying to say? Now, we know that in botanical illustration, the artist probably isn't trying to say anything other than to depict exactly what has been seen. So the purpose of the piece is for its scientific value, to show the world, basically, the features of these plants that might otherwise have gone undiscovered. And then I want you to evaluate it. And this is your opinion, this is what you think about it. Do you like this piece of art? Why do you like it? Why don't you like it? Is this a quality piece of art? And what makes it a quality piece of art? What is the best thing about this piece? And what's the worst thing about this piece? Has the artist been successful? And why? So I'm going to leave you to it. I want you to do a bit of an overview of who Sir Joseph Banks was, and then I want you to critique his piece of art. And I'm really keen to read these. Make sure you get those 4 concepts in. Being able to critique art is quite a skill to have, and I think you can do it. I think you'll do a really, really good job of it. And then hopefully today we've learned about Sir Joseph Banks, we've learnt about botanical illustration, and as the term goes on, we're going to really build up our knowledge and get ready to do it ourselves. So I'll leave you to it. I hope you enjoy it. Send us a copy of what you've done. I'd love to see it. See you soon.